The C-130 Hercules transport aircraft shuddered through the Afghan sky at 28,000 feet, its four turboprop engines laboring against winds that shouldn't exist at this altitude. Inside the cargo hold, 47 souls sat strapped to red webbing seats, their faces masks of stoic acceptance. They were going home after 15 months of desert hell, and nothing should have been able to touch them here, suspended between earth and heaven in the relative safety of controlled airspace. But something was wrong. Captain Vera Ghost Kozlowski felt it first in her fingertips where they rested on the yoke. The aircraft's response had grown sluggish over the past 10 minutes, subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, hadn't noticed yet. He was busy updating their flight plan with Kabul Tower, his voice crisp and professional over the radio. But Vera's hands, scarred from 3 tour and more close calls than she cared to count, could read an aircraft's mood like a lover's heartbeat. The mystery deepened when she glanced at her instruments. Oil pressure normal, hydraulics green, engine parameters within tolerance. Yet the Hercules was dying beneath her hands, bleeding altitude in microscopic increments that wouldn't show on radar for another few minutes. She'd seen this before, in a different war, in a different sky, when systems failed in ways that defied explanation and good pilots became statistics in official reports. Tower, Raven 77 requesting priority handling for mechanical irregularities, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her stomach. The response crackled back immediately, too quickly, as if they'd been waiting for her call. Raven 77 Tower, say nature of emergency. Emergency. The word hung in the recycled air of the cockpit like smoke from a funeral pyre. Vera hadn't used that word yet, but somehow Tower already knew. Her fingers tightened on the controls as she felt the aircraft's death throes beginning in earnest now, a subtle vibration that would soon become violent shaking, then structural failure, then 47 body bags, and an investigation that would blame pilot error. Behind her, in the cargo hold, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was the first passenger to notice something amiss. She'd been reading a worn paperback novel, counting down the hours until she could hold her daughter again, when the quality of the engine noise changed. It was nothing obvious, nothing that would alarm a civilian, but Santos had spent 12 years maintaining helicopters and knew the difference between an engine working and an engine dying. She looked up from her book and caught the eye of Corporal James Mitchell across the narrow aisle. He'd heard it too. They shared a look that said everything and nothing, two veterans who'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous moment of any deployment was the moment you thought you were safe. The C-130 Hercules continued its deceptive flight toward what should have been home, carrying its cargo of hopes and fears through a sky that had suddenly become hostile territory. And in the cockpit, Captain Vera Ghost Kozlowski began to fight for 47 lives with hands that had been steady in every crisis, except the one that had earned her that call sign. Webb finally looked up from his radio, nodding the tension in his pilot's shoulders. "Everything okay, Captain?" Vera's response was cut short by an alarm that split the air like a scream. The mystery was about to reveal itself, and none of them were prepared for what it would demand in return. The hydraulic failure manifested as a sudden jerk to port, violent enough to throw the passengers against their restraints and send loose gear clattering across the cargo deck. Webb's coffee cup shattered against the cockpit wall, adding the acrid smell of burnt caffeine to the cocktail of fear that was beginning to permeate the aircraft. "Primary hydraulics are gone," Webb reported, his training overriding the fear in his voice. "Switching to backup systems." But Vera already knew it wouldn't be enough. The backup hydraulics were hemorrhaging pressure at an alarming rate, visible as amber warning lights cascading across her instrument panel like falling stars. She'd seen this exact failure mode before, in a classified briefing that had made her stomach turn and her superiors uncomfortable when she'd asked too many pointed questions about maintenance protocols and cost-cutting measures. "Tower, Raven 77 declaring emergency," she transmitted, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Multiple hydraulic failures, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airfield. The response came not from Kabul Tower but from a different voice entirely, crisp, American, with the unmistakable cadence of military precision. Raven 77, this is Olympus Control. We're tracking your situation. Turn left heading 270, descend to flight level 240. Olympus Control. Vera's blood chilled. She'd never heard that call sign before, but the authority in the voice suggested connections that went far above her pay grade. Whatever was happening to her aircraft, it wasn't random mechanical failure. Someone had been waiting, watching, preparing for this exact scenario. In the cargo hold, the passengers were beginning to understand that their homecoming had taken a dark turn. Santos unbuckled herself and began moving through the cabin, her medic training kicking in as she assessed the minor injuries from the sudden maneuver. Mitchell was already helping an Air Force technician who'd struck his head on a support strut, blood seeping through his fingers as he held a field dressing to the wound. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vera's voice came through the intercom, steady and professional despite the chaos surrounding her. "We're experiencing some mechanical difficulties and will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened. We'll have you on the ground safely within the hour." The lie came easily, born from years of training that emphasized calm leadership over brutal honesty. The truth was that she wasn't sure they had an hour. The backup hydraulics were failing faster than her emergency checklists anticipated, and the aircraft's response to her inputs was becoming increasingly erratic. Webb was working through the emergency procedures with mechanical precision, but Vera could see the doubt creeping into his movements. He was a good pilot, competent and steady, but he'd never faced a situation where the rulebook might have been written by the same people who'd caused the problem. "Ghost," he said quietly, using her call sign for the first time in months. "How are we going to get her down?" The question hung between them like a prayer offered to an empty sky. Vera stared at the instrument panel, watching systems fail in sequence, each amber light another step toward catastrophe. But beneath the fear, beneath the immediate tactical problem of keeping 47 people alive for the next hour, a deeper realization was taking hold. Someone wanted them to crash. Someone with enough influence to monitor their flight, enough resources to cause cascade failures, enough coldness to sacrifice 47 lives for whatever larger game they were playing. And somehow, her call sign, the name she'd earned in blood and silence during a mission she wasn't supposed to discuss, was connected to it all. The sky outside the cockpit windows looked deceptively peaceful, an endless expanse of blue that promised safety but delivered only questions. And somewhere in that vast emptiness, other aircraft were moving, vectoring toward their position with purpose that had nothing to do with rescue. The first F-22 Raptor appeared as a distant speck against the mountains, its angular silhouette unmistakable even at range. Then another, and another, until 6 of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft were packing the dying transport, their formation precise and purposeful. Webb spotted them first, his voice tight with confusion. "Ghost, we've got company. 6 Raptors in escort formation." Vera's hands remained steady on the controls, but her mind was racing through implications that made her stomach clench. F-22s didn't provide escort for routine medical emergencies. They didn't scramble for simple mechanical failures. They responded to threats, to situations that required the ultimate expression of American air power. "Raven 77, this is Viper Lead," crackled through their radio, the voice young and professional. "We're here to provide escort. Request you maintain current heading and altitude." The irony wasn't lost on her. 47 souls aboard a dying aircraft, being escorted to their fate by fighters that represented the pinnacle of aerial warfare. It was either the most elaborate rescue operation in military history or something far more sinister. Santos pressed her face to one of the small cargo windows and caught sight of the formation. Her blood ran cold. She'd served long enough to recognize the difference between protection and containment, and the way those raptors held their position suggested the latter. They weren't there to guide them to safety. They were there to ensure the C-130 went exactly where someone wanted it to go. Captain, Santos called through the intercom. "Ma'am, there are fighters outside. A lot of them." The passengers' faces turned toward the windows, 46 pairs of eyes trying to process what they were seeing. Some looked relieved. American fighters meant American protection, meant someone was looking out for them. Others, the veterans with more experience in the gray areas of military operations, began to understand that their situation had just become far more complicated. Mitchell unstrapped himself and moved toward the cockpit, his instincts telling him that whatever was happening went beyond simple mechanical failure. He'd been in enough classified briefings to recognize the weight of secrets, and the atmosphere aboard their aircraft had taken on that familiar heaviness. In the cockpit, Vera was running through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Her call sign, Ghost, had been earned during a mission over Syria 3 years ago, a mission that officially never happened and unofficially had prevented a terrorist cell from acquiring surface-to-air missiles that could have changed the balance of power in the region. The details were classified above her security clearance, but she remembered the faces of the men she'd killed, remembered the silence that had followed the explosions, remembered earning a call sign that spoke to her ability to appear where she was needed and disappear before consequences could follow. But ghosts, she was learning, could be summoned by those who knew the right words, the right pressures, the right levers of control. And someone was summoning her now, using 46 innocent lives as collateral in a game she didn't understand. "Ghost," Webb said quietly, "what aren't you telling me?" The question demanded honesty she wasn't sure she could provide. How do you explain that your past might be killing everyone around you? How do you admit that the very skills that made you an asset also made you a liability? The C-130's engines coughed, a sound like mechanical death rattles that told her time was running out for philosophical discussions. Whatever forces had engineered this crisis, they were moving toward an endgame that she couldn't see but could feel approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. The mountains below looked like broken teeth, all sharp edges and hidden valleys where aircraft could disappear forever. And still, the F-22s maintained their formation, patient as buzzards, waiting for orders that would determine whether 47 people lived or died based on calculations being made in rooms she'd never seen by people whose names she'd never know. "Webb," she said finally, "there are things about my service record that might be relevant to our current situation. Things I can't discuss, but things that might explain why we're getting this level of attention." It was as close to the truth as her security clearances would allow, and closer than she'd come to admitting that her past was a loaded weapon pointed at everyone she'd sworn to protect. The radio crackled with a new voice, older, more authoritative, speaking with the kind of quiet confidence that came from having the power to make final decisions. "Ghost, this is Overlord. We need to talk." Webb looked at her with questions he couldn't ask and suspicions he couldn't voice. The passengers behind them were counting on her to get them home safely. The fighters around them were waiting for orders that might contradict that goal. And somewhere in the vast machinery of military command, people were making calculations about acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices. Vera keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the weight of 46 lives pressing down on her shoulders. "Overlord, Ghost, I'm listening." But even as she said the words, she was planning, calculating, remembering the training that had taught her to be a ghost in the first place. Because sometimes the only way to save everyone was to disappear so completely that even your enemies couldn't find you to finish what they'd started. The conversation that followed would be conducted in code, in implication, in the careful language of people who dealt in secrets and consequences. But beneath the professional courtesy and operational necessity, everyone involved understood that they were negotiating the price of 46 lives against the value of whatever truth Ghost carried in her classified memories. The mountains waited below, indifferent to the moral complexity of the decisions being made above them. And high overhead, satellites watched and recorded, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved for historians who might never be allowed to read the real story of what transpired when a transport full of veterans became pawns in a game where the rules were classified and the stakes were measured in body counts. The voice from Overlord was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing weather patterns instead of life and death. Ghost, 3 years ago you were involved in Operation Silent Thunder. Our intelligence suggests that certain parties have become aware of your involvement and consider you a security risk. The euphemism was elegant in its brutality. Security risk. Two words that could justify almost any action, any sacrifice, any betrayal of the people who'd served their country with honor and expected that service to mean something in return. Vera felt the familiar chill that came with classified revelations, the understanding that she was standing at the intersection of official necessity and human cost. Overlord Ghost, I'm not sure I understand the relevance to our current mechanical emergency, she replied, playing for time while her mind raced through implications. Around her, the C-130 continued its wounded flight, systems failing in sequence as if following some predetermined script. Webb was watching her face, reading the micro-expressions that years of combat had taught him to interpret. He'd seen that look before, in briefing rooms when missions went sideways and comfortable assumptions died under the weight of operational reality. Whatever Ghost was discussing with Overlord, it went far beyond their current emergency. Ghost, the mechanical failures you're experiencing aren't accidental. Certain interested parties wanted to ensure you didn't reach your destination alive. We've intervened to provide alternative options. The admission hung in the air like cordite smoke. Someone had tried to kill her, had tried to murder 46 innocent people to eliminate one woman whose crime was serving her country too well in situations that officially didn't exist. And now, apparently, other someones were offering to save those lives in exchange for considerations that hadn't been specified yet. Santos was moving through the cargo hold, her medic instincts keeping her busy with the minor injuries from their earlier maneuver. But her ears were tuned to the subtle changes in engine noise, the slight variations in vibration that told the story of an aircraft slowly dying around them. She'd seen enough mechanical failures to know that their pilot was performing miracles just to keep them airborne. "Ma'am," Mitchell said quietly into the intercom, "we're losing altitude." It wasn't a question. The veterans aboard could feel it in their bones, that subtle sensation of descent that spoke to instincts honed by too many combat flights where altitude meant life and ground level meant death. They weren't panicking. Panic was a luxury they'd learned to live without, but they were preparing themselves for whatever came next. Vera felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. 46 lives depending on decisions she had to make without complete information, without understanding the full scope of the forces arrayed against them. She'd been in similar situations before, but never with so many civilians at stake, never with the knowledge that her own classified past was the reason they were all in danger. "Overlord, what are you proposing?" she asked, the words careful and precise. The pause that followed was long enough for her to count heartbeats, long enough for the C-130 to lose another 100 feet of precious altitude, long enough for her to study the faces of the F-22 pilots visible through their canopies. They were young, professional, probably unaware of the larger game being played around them. "Ghost, we're prepared to provide landing clearance at a secure facility where this situation can be resolved. In exchange, we'll need your cooperation in debriefing certain aspects of Operation Silent Thunder." Cooperation. Another euphemism, this one carrying the weight of interrogation rooms and classified documents, and the kind of conversations where the wrong answer could mean spending the rest of her life in federal prison or worse. But 46 lives hung in the balance, and the mathematics of survival rarely allowed for moral complexity. Webb was working through emergency procedures with increasing desperation, but they both knew that conventional solutions wouldn't work against unconventional problems. Their aircraft was dying by design, not accident, and the only way to save it was to accept help from people whose motives were as opaque as their methods were effective. The radio crackled with Viper Lead's voice, younger and more immediate than Overlord's measured tones. "Ghost, we're showing you at flight level 180 and descending. Request you advise your intentions." 180, 18,000 feet and falling, with mountain peaks reaching up toward them like grasping fingers. They had minutes, not hours, before decisions would be made for them by gravity and geography. Vera looked at her instruments, at the cascade of warning lights that told the story of systematic sabotage disguised as mechanical failure. She looked at Webb, whose trust in her was absolute despite the secrets she couldn't share. She thought of Santos and Mitchell and 44 other souls whose only crime was serving their country and wanting to come home alive. "Overlord Ghost, transmit coordinates for your secure facility." The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but sometimes the only choice was between falling and jumping, between accepting unknown consequences and facing certain death. She'd earned her call sign by making hard choices in impossible situations, and this was just another test of skills she'd hoped never to need again. But even as she spoke the words, she was already planning, already thinking 3 moves ahead like the chess player her father had taught her to be. Because accepting help from ghosts didn't mean trusting them, and survival sometimes required betraying the people who thought they held all the cards. The coordinates came through the radio in crisp, professional tones, marking a location on their navigation display that showed an airfield in a valley she'd never heard of, surrounded by mountains that could hide secrets as easily as aircraft. It was a place where questions could be asked and answered away from public scrutiny, where the normal rules of military justice might bend under the weight of national security concerns. "Roger, Overlord," she transmitted, Raven 77 proceeding to designated coordinates. But her hands on the controls were already making subtle adjustments, small corrections that wouldn't show on the F-22's tracking systems, but would give her options when the time came to choose between compliance and conscience. Because sometimes the only way to save everyone was to make sure that the people trying to save you never got everything they wanted in return. The secure facility appeared on their navigation display like a digital mirage, coordinates resolving into what appeared to be a standard military airfield tucked into a valley between 2 mountain ranges. But Vera's experience with classified operations told her that nothing about this destination would be standard, that the moment they touched down would mark the beginning of a different kind of battle entirely. Webb was nursing their dying systems with the kind of professional competence that made the difference between controlled flight and catastrophic failure. The backup hydraulics were operating at 30% capacity, enough to maintain basic control, but not enough to guarantee a safe landing under normal circumstances. And nothing about their circumstances could be considered normal. "Ghost," he said quietly, "you want to tell me what we're really flying into?" The question deserved honesty, but honesty was a luxury she couldn't afford with 46 lives at stake. How do you explain that the people offering to save you might be just as dangerous as the ones who tried to kill you? How do you admit that your classified past was about to become everyone's present danger? "I don't know, Webb, but it's better than the alternative." In the cargo hold, Santos was conducting a quiet inventory of their situation. 46 passengers, most of them walking wounded from 15 months of desert combat, all of them depending on a pilot whose reputation for getting people home safely was legendary throughout their command. But legends, she was learning, sometimes carried prices that nobody anticipated. Mitchell had positioned himself near the crew chief's station, his infantry instincts telling him to maintain fields of fire and situational awareness, even in a transport aircraft. He'd noticed that several of their passengers were carrying personal weapons despite regulations, and he was beginning to suspect that their current situation might require those weapons before it was resolved. The F-22 formation was adjusting its pattern, the 6 fighters repositioning themselves in what looked like a standard escort formation, but felt like something more controlling. Vera could see their lead pilot through his canopy, young and focused, probably following orders without understanding their full implications. "Viper lead Ghost," she transmitted. "Request you maintain current formation until we're on final approach." "Roger, Ghost, will be with you all the way down." The words carried multiple meanings, comfort and threat wrapped together in professional courtesy. They would indeed be with her all the way down, ensuring that she arrived exactly where someone wanted her to arrive, with no opportunity for course corrections or changes of heart. The valley opened below them like a carefully prepared trap, its airfield visible as a geometric scar across the landscape. Hangars and control towers and vehicle parks arranged with military precision, everything clean and functional, and completely isolated from public oversight. It was the kind of place where inconvenient questions could be asked and uncomfortable answers provided without media attention or congressional inquiry. Vera began her descent, fighting systems that wanted to fail and trying to ignore the implications of the decision she'd already made. Behind her, 46 people trusted her to get them home safely, unaware that home might be redefined by forces beyond their control or understanding. The radio crackled with a new voice, ground control at their mystery destination, professional and efficient, and somehow ominous in its very normalcy. "Raven 77, Sierra Control, runway 27 cleared for emergency landing, emergency vehicles standing by." Emergency vehicles. The phrase suggested preparation that went beyond simple mechanical assistance, preparation for outcomes that might require medical intervention or worse. Vera felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came before combat operations, the understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether her story ended in success or tragedy. Webb was running through pre-landing checklists with methodical precision, but his eyes kept drifting to the F-22s that bracketed their descent like honor guards at a funeral. "Ghost, once we're on the ground, what's our play?" It was a good question, one that she'd been considering since the moment she'd accepted Overlord's offer. Once they were on the ground, surrounded by security forces at a classified facility, her options would be limited by fences and armed guards, and the kind of legal frameworks that made troublesome problems disappear. "We get our people to safety first," she said. "Everything else is secondary." But even as she spoke the words, she was planning for contingencies that went far beyond simple personnel safety. Because sometimes the only way to protect the people you served with was to ensure that the people trying to control you never got the chance to finish what they'd started. The runway rose to meet them like an accusation, concrete and steel waiting to transform their airborne crisis into a ground-based confrontation. And somewhere in the valley below, people with classified agendas and unlimited authority were preparing to collect on debts that she'd never agreed to owe. The landing was harder than it should have been, the C-130's compromised systems making every adjustment a negotiation between pilot intention and mechanical reality. Vera fought the aircraft through its final approach, feeling the ground effect take hold as they crossed the runway threshold, feeling the main gear touch down with the kind of solid impact that meant they were committed now to whatever came next. The thrust reversers engaged with a roar that drowned out conversation, and suddenly, They were decelerating down a runway that looked like every other military airfield in the world, except for the subtle details that marked it as something more specialized. The aircraft that lined the taxiways weren't standard military types. They were the kind of modified transports and surveillance planes that suggested intelligence operations and classified missions. "Welcome to Groom Lake Extension," came through the radio, the call sign confirming what Vieira had already suspected. They hadn't just landed at a secure facility. They'd landed at a facility that didn't officially exist, where the normal rules of military protocol were superseded by the requirements of operations that couldn't be discussed in congressional hearings or newspaper articles. Webb shut down the engines with practiced efficiency, but his movements carried the weight of understanding that their situation had just become infinitely more complicated. Groom Lake Extension meant compartmented programs and need-to-know briefings, and the kind of security classifications that could make people disappear if they asked the wrong questions. Through the cockpit windows, they could see vehicles approaching across the tarmac, not the standard emergency response trucks they'd expected, but black SUVs with tinted windows and the kind of radio antennas that suggested serious communication capabilities. The men who emerged from those vehicles wore civilian clothes but moved with military precision, their body language speaking of authority that didn't need uniforms to be respected. In the cargo hold, Santos was helping passengers unbuckle from their seats, her medic training keeping her focused on immediate needs, while her survival instincts cataloged details that might become important later. The way the aircraft had been guided to this particular parking spot, isolated from other traffic. The way their F-22 escort was maintaining its formation, even though they were safely on the ground. The way none of the approaching vehicles looked like standard passenger transport. Mitchell had positioned himself near the crew entry door, his infantry experience telling him to control access points until the tactical situation became clearer. He'd noticed that several of their passengers were combat veterans with the kind of instincts that made them dangerous if cornered, and he was beginning to suspect that they might need those instincts before this situation resolved itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vieira announced through the aircraft's PA system, "we've landed safely at a military facility where maintenance personnel will address our mechanical issues. Please remain seated while we coordinate ground transportation." It was another necessary lie, born from the understanding that panic served no one and that 46 people needed leadership, not brutal honesty about circumstances beyond their control. But beneath the professional calm, everyone aboard understood that they'd crossed a line from routine military transport to something that felt increasingly like detention. The crew entry door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and the first civilian to board wasn't interested in mechanical problems or passenger comfort. He was middle-aged, professionally dressed, and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that came from having the power to make decisions that affected other people's lives without concerning himself overmuch with their preferences. "Captain Kozlowski," he said, his voice carrying the neutral tones of someone accustomed to conducting difficult conversations. "I'm Agent Harrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to discuss some aspects of your service record." Defense Intelligence Agency. The words carried implications that made Vieira's stomach tighten with familiar dread. The DIA handled the kind of intelligence operations that crossed borders and ignored conventional military protocols, the kind of missions that required plausible deniability and careful management of inconvenient witnesses. "Agent Harrison," she replied, maintaining the professional courtesy that military training demanded even in circumstances that felt increasingly like a kidnapping. "I'd prefer to ensure my passengers are properly cared for before we discuss any classified matters." Harrison's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Your passengers will be debriefed separately. Standard security protocol for personnel who have been exposed to classified operations, even inadvertently." Debriefed. another euphemism that carried the weight of interrogation rooms and non-disclosure agreements, and the kind of legal frameworks that made it very difficult to discuss certain experiences with family members or congressional representatives or newspaper reporters. 46 people who'd been expecting to go home to their families were about to discover that home had been indefinitely postponed pending security reviews that might take months or years to complete. Santos stepped forward, her medic credentials giving her standing to speak. "Sir, several of our passengers require medical attention. We need to prioritize their immediate care." Harrison nodded with the kind of practiced sympathy that suggested he'd conducted similar conversations before. "Medical personnel are standing by. Everyone will receive appropriate care while we sort through the security implications of today's events." While we sort through. The phrase implied a process that might be measured in bureaucratic time rather than human urgency, a careful evaluation of risks and benefits that treated people as variables in equations rather than individuals with families and futures and constitutional rights. Webb remained in the pilot's seat, ostensibly securing his instruments but actually listening to every word of the conversation taking place behind him. His co-pilot training had taught him to be ready for any contingency, and his combat experience told him that contingencies in classified facilities often involved outcomes that weren't discussed in training manuals. "Captain," Harrison continued, "your cooperation in this matter will be noted and appreciated. The information you possess regarding Operation Silent Thunder is vital to ongoing national security interests." Operation Silent Thunder. The words hung in the recycled air of the aircraft like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying with them the weight of classified missions and official secrets, and the kind of operational realities that existed in the gray areas between legal authorization and practical necessity. Vera had known this moment would come eventually, had understood from the moment she'd earned her call sign that the mission in Syria carried consequences that would follow her for the rest of her career. But she'd hoped those consequences would remain theoretical, abstract concerns that lived in classified files rather than concrete realities that affected the lives of people she was sworn to protect. "Agent Harrison," she said carefully, "I'm willing to cooperate with any legitimate security review, but I want your assurance that my passengers will be treated with the respect and consideration their service has earned." It was a reasonable request that carried the weight of implied threats, the understanding that cooperation had limits, and that even classified operations were subject to certain moral constraints. But Harrison's response suggested that moral constraints were luxuries that national security interests couldn't always afford. "Captain, your passengers are now part of a classified operation, whether they chose to be or not. Their treatment will depend on the level of cooperation we receive from all parties involved." The threat was elegant in its implication, professional in its delivery, and absolutely clear in its meaning. 46 lives hung in the balance of decisions that Vera would make in the next few minutes, decisions that would determine whether the people who'd trusted her to get them home safely would ever see their families again. The cargo hold had fallen silent, except for the quiet conversations of veterans who understood that their situation had taken a turn toward the kind of complications that weren't resolved by conventional military protocols. They'd served in enough classified operations to recognize the signs, the subtle indicators that suggested they'd become inconvenient witnesses to events that official policy preferred to forget. Santos was still moving through the cabin, ostensibly checking on minor injuries, but actually positioning herself to provide medical support if the situation deteriorated into the kind of confrontation that required trauma care. Her instincts told her that tensions were escalating toward a breaking point that might be measured in casualties rather than diplomatic solutions. Mitchell had noted the positions of the civilian personnel who'd boarded their aircraft, cataloging weapons and communication equipment, and exit routes with the kind of professional assessment that prepared him for multiple contingencies. He'd served under Captain Kozlowski before and trusted her judgment, but trust didn't eliminate the need for tactical awareness when facing uncertain situations. "Agent Harrison," Vera said finally, "I need a moment to brief my crew on the situation before we proceed." Harrison checked his watch with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested schedules were being maintained and procedures followed despite the human complications involved. "You have 5 minutes, Captain. Then we begin the debriefing process." 5 minutes to explain to 46 people that their homecoming had been indefinitely postponed, that their families would be told they were involved in classified security reviews, that their freedom was now contingent on the outcome of negotiations they wouldn't be allowed to witness or influence. Vera keyed her microphone and addressed her passengers with the kind of calm professionalism that had carried her through 3 combat tours and more crises than she cared to remember. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to security considerations related to our flight today, we'll be remaining at this facility for debriefing. I know this isn't what any of us expected, but I need everyone to remain calm and follow the instructions of the personnel who will be assisting us." The silence that followed her announcement was heavy with understanding and resignation, and the kind of bitter acceptance that came from serving a country that sometimes treated its veterans as potential security threats rather than honored defenders. They'd all signed papers acknowledging that their service might involve classified operations and security reviews, but none of them had expected those abstractions to become concrete realities that separated them from their families indefinitely. Webb finally turned in his seat, his face carrying the weight of questions he couldn't ask and suspicions he couldn't voice. "Ghost, whatever happens next, you know you can count on us." The words were simple and carried the absolute loyalty that developed between aircrew who'd faced death together and survived through skill and teamwork and mutual trust. Whatever Agent Harrison and his colleagues had planned, they would face it together with the kind of solidarity that made military units more than collections of individuals. But Vera understood that solidarity might not be enough against forces that operated outside the normal constraints of military justice and constitutional protection. The men who'd boarded their aircraft represented the kind of power that made inconvenient problems disappear, and 46 veterans had just become very inconvenient indeed. The 5 minutes passed like heartbeats in a cardiac arrest, each second carrying them closer to a confrontation that would determine whether her story ended in capitulation or resistance, whether the people she'd sworn to protect would become casualties in a war they'd never agreed to fight. Agent Harrison returned with additional personnel, their professional demeanor carrying the weight of procedures that had been rehearsed and contingencies that had been planned for. They moved through the aircraft with practiced efficiency, separating passengers into groups that suggested different levels of security, concern, and different types of questioning. "Captain Kozlowski," Harrison said, "if you'll come with us, we can begin your portion of the process." The moment of decision had arrived with bureaucratic politeness and procedural efficiency, wrapped in the kind of professional courtesy that made resistance seem ungrateful and cooperation seem reasonable. But beneath the civilized exterior, everyone involved understood that this was a kidnapping conducted under the authority of national security classifications and justified by the requirements of operations that couldn't be discussed in public forums. Vera rose from her pilot's seat, her movements carrying the kind of controlled precision that combat veterans learned to maintain under stress. She'd made her decision, accepting Harrison's offer to save 46 lives, but acceptance didn't mean surrender. Sometimes the only way to protect the people you served with was to make sure that the people trying to control you never got everything they wanted in return. As she walked toward the aircraft's exit, she caught Santos's eye in.